How do I know if my church has been revitalized? We're going to answer that question with 5 points today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball, and I am joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. And today, we are brought to you by Faith Street. Faith Street is an iOS and Android app that brings congregations together. It strengthens people's commitment to the church and to each other by helping to build that discipleship community by prompting prayer and mindfulness and generosity, reflection, fellowship, and teaching as daily practices. Faith Street helps you and your staff spend less time on social media and communications and rely less on Facebook and the weekly email newsletter. It's built by church leaders for church leaders. So, to check out Faith Street, go to faithstreet.com/Malphurs, faithstreet.com/Malphurs, MALPHURS. And as one of our listeners, you get 20% off their service. So check it out, see if it's a good fit for your church. Okay, AJ, this is the Church Revitalization Podcast. So we talk a lot about church revitalization and church revitalization processes and things like that. But it seems like it's worth asking the question, how do we know if your church is revitalized? How do I know if my church is revitalized? Is it a numbers thing? Is it like we're growing by a certain percentage or what? How could we know that we've sort of moved from declining to revitalized?
Yeah.
And that's the question I want to hit today.
It's definitely not any one thing. It will encompass a lot of things. We're going to talk about 5 of them today, but of course, Scott, it would be much bigger than that. But I would hope that after these 5 things, maybe as some major categories or genres of revitalization, that leaders would be able to think, okay, I think I'm seeing other indicators in my church that maybe we're beginning to pull out of a downward trajectory that we were in for many years.
Yeah, I think that maybe just a couple of notes to preface before we hop into our 5 things here. First, I want to say that church growth alone is not necessarily an indicator that the church is being revitalized. Mm-hmm. It may be a byproduct and should be a byproduct of revitalization, I would say. But it's not necessarily the leading indicator. In fact, very often in a revitalization process, because you're engaging in change, AJ, you may actually have some people leave. Mm-hmm. And so if your sole marker for success is number of people, then you may quit before you see the results, because you're seeing some, if you kind of retreat to the status quo, the second people start to leave because you're making changes, you're not going to get the benefit of that revitalization process. So I think it's worth noting that while growth might be an indicator of revitalization and one that's likely to occur down the road, it's not usually the first indicator. And so that's why we're recording this episode, is we think there are other things that you can look at.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the picture that just came to mind as you were saying that, Scott, we've never kind of talked about this as any sort of having any parallels, but I mean, look at the groundwork that Jesus did in 3 years of ministry.
Yeah.
And then went to the tomb for 3 days. I mean, look at that low point in the formation of the church before the explosion of growth that happened after that. Yeah. I think in no way is church revitalization am I making the same, this is a direct thing, but I'm just saying you will take some time to lay the foundations and build teams and get ready to launch, and then you might go through this period in which you're like, is the opposite happening? But no,
I think there is obviously the magnitude is significantly different, but there is a correlation there, and that the disciples felt like they had signed up for one thing and were getting something different. And as you engage in a revitalization process, it is not only possible, but likely that your congregation or even people on your, what we call a strategic leadership team, but a revitalization team, something like that, you're going to get to a certain point where they're going to realize that this is different than what they bargained for. And some may even fall away from the process or leave your church or whatever. And it's only when you kind of push through that you see the fruit of it. And even then, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be this exponential explosion on the other end of it, which is the second sort of caveat I want to make here, AJ, which is a revitalized church has a different trend than a declining church. It's not necessarily exponential. We just need to reframe our whole set of expectations. You don't expect, oh, we're going to go through this revitalization process, we're going to lose no one, and we're also going to become a mega church tomorrow. Not only is that not a realistic expectation, I don't even know that that's a healthy one, because that might be more about your ego and your self-perception of success than it would be about what it is that God has intended for your church. Could you become a mega church tomorrow? Sure. But that shouldn't be your goal in a revitalization process. It should be to become a healthy, sustainable, growing church doing kingdom work. So
it's unlikely.
All of that preface.
You're probably not going to have an Acts 2:41 moment in which 5,000 are added to your number that day. But
you could.
Could.
You might not.
Unlikely. Possible, unlikely.
So all that to say, what would be some leading indicators that your church is revitalized? That's what we want to give you today is don't judge your success necessarily by what you can see with your eyes. You want to take a more strategic and more intentional look to show whether or not your church is reversing the trends. So let's hop straight into them.
Let's go. Number one is that you would find yourself more Great Commission focused than you used to be. And this is where the rubber meets the road, right, Scott? I mean, this is keeping the main thing. So when your church, and this doesn't happen overnight, but it could happen in a relatively short period of time, relatively meaning months or a year. You could find a culture shift in your church by strategic and intentional work, that the Great Commission becomes not something that, maybe you did a sermon on once last year, but that people talk about, people know it, and they begin to see that making disciples and helping them mature in the faith becomes what you're about. You could call that mission. You could call that mission.
Yeah, most evangelical churches that we encounter pay really great lip service to the Great Commission from even a declining church. Will kind of know the right thing to say. Hey, we're a Great Commission church. We want to make immature disciples and all this. The problem is that the Great Commission is an also ran with a number of other unarticulated missions of the church to maintain the status quo, to keep people happy, to be a social club, so when the Great Commission is in competition with a number of other missions, I don't mean global missions, I mean like goals,
false missions,
false missions, then the one that loses is the Great Commission, because the Great Commission can't be an also ran. It has to be the thing that you do and that you care about. And so when we say you've become Great Commission focused, you might be thinking, well, we already are, so check. No, if you are a declining church, in all likelihood, you may care about the Great Commission, but you might also care about 3 or 4 other things that are not God's mission for your church, and those things are crowding out and beating down the Great Commission in your church.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. I worked with the church just recently. A credit to them if any of them are listening. They identified one of their culture shifts, AJ, that they want to make as prioritizing the Great Commission over the Great Tradition. And I loved that phrasing. And that's the shift that has to happen in your church as well. You got a Great Commission over the Great Tradition.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. Don't be merely hearers of the word, but doers.
Yep.
All right. Number 2, you might find that your church is now prioritizing a disciple-making culture internally. This is another shift that a revitalized church finds themselves making. And I might continue to say finds themselves. However, everything that we're talking about today is intentional and strategic. I guess I'll say you might find this because over time something might happen. You just look back and you're like, we've done it. We've made the shift that we needed to make. But I can tell you, it will not happen without intentional strategic planning to make it happen. These churches do not naturally, without intention, become fabulously healthy churches. So yeah, make sure that you understand that. So yeah, prioritizing a disciple-making culture. This is identifying, Scott, what does a mature disciple look like? Or what activities does a mature disciple participate in and spend their time on and prioritize in their own life? And we have got to build these into our churches. We've got to decide what should we be spending our time on and do our planning based on those things that are going to help people mature in their faith.
The Bible seems much more concerned about the kind of person that you are becoming than it does about what rituals or programs or types of things that you engage in, right? And for most churches, it's that adherence to ritual that marks someone as mature or immature. They come to Bible study every week. They are at church every week, whatever. And so to shift how you judge success in your church and success within an individual spiritual growth or spiritual health is what has to happen. And so as you start to look at Acts chapter 2 and see the kinds of behaviors that you see exhibited in the early church in terms of a mature disciple, that they're generous, that they're a praying community, that they're worshiping God as an overflow of their actions. Acts 2 says they were everyone was in awe, right? This is the act of worship and living in an act of worship. So all these things that we start to see, these things then become the markers of the culture that we want to create in our church. I think for a lot of churches, AJ, they don't know what kind of culture they want to have. And it's why they look around and they see people who have, a lot of gray hair in the church, but not necessarily a lot of mature disciples.
Yeah.
Because these are people who maybe still aren't sharing their faith very actively. They're very faithful to the church, to the organization, but they're not necessarily living out these discipleship behaviors that we see in Acts chapter 2. And so a shift that you make that indicates that you're a revitalized church is that we've become laser focused on creating that culture and setting the expectations for our folks that this is what you're going to look like if you're going to be a part of this community as you move forward. One example of this, AJ, anecdotal thing, worked with a church a few years ago that had a history of Easter being like a family service. So kids would go to church with their parents for the whole service. There would be no children's programming except for nursery. And they had this dream, this vision of reaching a neighboring apartment complex, and they'd been doing a lot of work to that end. And some folks came in, a lot of folks actually came in that Easter from the apartment complex, and they came up to the children's ministry area going, where can I check in my kids, right? Expecting that there would be some sort of a program for the kids, and there wasn't one, because that's not what they did for Easter. And in this discussion with this elder team, in the past, they would have said, well, we do family service, and here's all the reasons why we do this on Easter. But instead they said, okay, well, we've always done this. This has always been a family service, but we want to make disciples and we want to reach this community. And it seems to me that moving forward, we maybe need to have children's programming on Easter, even though we don't normally do that, because that's an expectation in the community and a need that's there. Mm-hmm. So let's reevaluate and make a shift for next Easter.
Yeah.
That was completely unprompted. I was sitting in that meeting, totally unprompted by me. And this is something that they never would have said a year before. And that, to me, from when I was working with that church, I knew I was done at that point, because I was like, they've made the switch. Their minds have changed. They're thinking about things differently, and they're going to be just fine. And a couple of years later, AJ, they are fine. They're doing really well. So
that's cool.
It can change. I know we're only on point 2, but I just want to say, if you're thinking that can't happen in my church, yes, it can. It can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it needs to. I mean, I don't know if we've ever even talked about this, Scott, but when I was, I guess, 13 years old, I was confirmed in my church, in the mainline denomination church that I attended around that age. And I couldn't tell you what, but I know at this point I had to memorize a lot of things for that process, but that was not a defining moment in my personal growth in my faith. I can't say I was any different after that process than I was before it. It was a point in time, and for all intents and purposes was relatively meaningless in the scope of my life. And so having things such as that, I'm not saying there's no value in those things, but a culture of disciple making that would have just naturally had people and myself moving into greater depth, probably would have, had a greater effect on my life at an earlier age than, the path I ended up on anyway on my own. So
that's a great segue to the third point.
There we go. Becoming process oriented instead of program oriented. And so this idea in which you're moving people along a pathway. I mean, that's what our faith walk is, in which they are naturally making progression into things that are going to turn them into disciple makers, instead of simply saying, here's something to do on a Wednesday night or a Sunday night. And again, everything that we're really talking about here becomes culture. And that's a hard thing, I think, Scott, for a lot of leaders to grasp. Every church has a culture or multiple. And unless you put the effort in to really perceive what that is, and then to think about how you're going to work on outputs or ends, develop the means to reach particular ends, then you're always just going to be kind of, we've talked about, like the Sunday to Sunday hamster wheel and of just, keeping the place going week to week instead of really working on moving somewhere together. So these are the kinds of things that go into a process-oriented, growth-focused, personal growth and discipleship-focused church, instead of one that simply has things that happen on the calendar that are good, but not really going somewhere.
Yeah, I know, because I've had this conversation with a lot of churches. There's a sense that it maybe is a distinction without a difference to say, because in a process-oriented approach, the question is, well, then are there not programs? Yes, there are programs. So then the response is that not a distinction without a difference. If there's still programs, then what's the difference between being process oriented and program oriented? And the distinction is this, that in a process oriented approach, the programs are in service of the process.
Great way of putting that.
In a program oriented, the process may be, if there is one at all, usually there's not, it would be in service of the programs. Or put another way, discipleship is the programs, which is not true. Whereas you could say discipleship is a process, and then we have programs which facilitate that process. The reason why that matters is because churches become married to their programs, and they can't think of church or doing church outside of the framework of the programs that they've always done. And this is one of the things, we've talked about this many times on the podcast, but this is one of the things that COVID blew up. When you couldn't do all of your programs anymore or do them the same way, people couldn't conceive of how to do church. And it's always been our contention on this podcast, and we'll continue to beat this horse, that if you were to think about discipleship primarily as a process first, then it doesn't matter what the programs are. You can adjust and shift the programs so long as you keep the process in view. So what is that process? And if you're confused by this and you're thinking, well, I don't even know what it would mean or look like to have a discipleship process, email leadership@malfirstgroup.com. We would love to talk to you. But become caring more about guiding people through that process so that they actually grow and that they don't get stuck anywhere along that process, and that they actually become disciple makers. Listen, AJ, the stats are something like, I can't remember the exact number. I don't want to get the stat wrong, but it's the majority. The majority of Christians will not kind of lead even one person to Christ in their lifetime.
Yeah, right.
That's a failure.
Yeah. Well, and an increasing number don't even think church is necessary for their personal growth. So. Right.
So we've got a lot of churches with a lot of people with gray hair. I'm not trying to rag on, I feel like now this is the second time I brought this up this episode, but I'm trying to rag on old people in churches and that they're not doing what they're supposed to. Because I don't blame them. I blame the leaders of these churches. We have created a framework, AJ, where showing up on Sunday and going to 6 different Bible studies was enough.
Yeah.
Without framing it in such a way that evangelism is the end and replicating yourself as a disciple is the ultimate measure of success. And because of that, we have a whole bunch of people who know a lot about the Bible who aren't actually engaging with their community at all.
Yep.
And it's causing the collapse of the church.
Yeah.
They're not growing leaders. They're not replicating themselves. They're not visible in the community, and the results are self-evident. So we have to make this shift. And if you look at your church and go, hey, we care more about the process now than we care about the programs, that's an indicator that your church is revitalized.
Yeah. Amen. Hard truth. Number 4, if your church has become revitalized or is making progress towards that, you likely are now seeing a clear picture of the future that has come into view, and it's shared among your congregation. And you've also recognized some signposts along the way of progress towards that future. So there's a big picture has come into focus, and there's some waypoints that you've identified between here and there that that you need to be working on, or maybe that you've begun to make some successes in. And so now you truly are unified and heading, excuse me, to the same destination together. This is an important thing. We call this vision. But it's a picture that everybody begins to see together. And it's an amazing moment it's an amazing moment just in a small leadership team when this comes into clarity. But then over time, this is not something that, you can't preach on it then, the week after a really dynamic meeting and everybody just gets it. This is something else that takes a little bit of time, but
Yeah.
it would certainly be one of those things that you as a church leader, you would be able to remember the catalyst moment, maybe in which it was developed and defined, and then be able to look back and say, wow, over these months or over this last year, you can just feel people have become excited because they know what they're there for. It's cool.
Yeah, it's not difficult even for a guest to walk into a room and sense this is a place that's going somewhere versus this is a place that's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not usually based on the number of activities that are on the calendar. It's a visceral sense that the church has a dream, a shared dream for the future. And it's famously been said that vision leaks. So sometimes pastors will do a vision Sunday once a year or something like that. That's no good. I mean, that's good, but then that vision is going to leak out. And while you as the pastor may, or even a leadership team or a board may always have the vision on your minds, and it's been my experience that even that's not the case. Pastors get distracted and so do boards. So you kind of have to fill up your own vision bucket. But certainly the congregation, they're not catching that all the time. So you have to constantly remind of the vision of where you're going. Mm-hmm. And if you can look back, kind of look at your church and go, yeah, we're doing that. Like we're weaving in our vision in some form or fashion, explicitly or implicitly every Sunday into what we're doing. That's a good sign. If it's been a long time since you've talked about where you're going and what the point of all this is, there's a good chance that you're not revitalized yet.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you're actually making progress towards your vision, there'll be evidence, and that evidence needs to be displayed. You've got to show it to people, because that's the best way of keeping it in front of them. Not just with words, reminding them, here's what we're all about. But like, look what happened. Look at this event, or look at these people, or look at this group, or this whatever it was, this function, that we've been working on. Look at the results of this. And let's celebrate that. That's the best way for people to go, I've been listening to you talk about this. Now I get it. Now I see what you're talking about. That stuff is golden. All right.
Which is a good segue to number 5. The only way that any of that happens is number 5.
That's right. The only way that happens is by planning for it to happen. So if you look back over the last year or two and you discover that you truly are working a plan that you strategically and intentionally developed, instead of always talking about maybe planning to do something one of these days, then you probably are working now in a church that has become or is working on becoming revitalized. And so this is what makes it all happen, right, Scott? I mean, the other 4 things are awesome, but they don't happen without intentionality. And so you've got to huddle up together. You've got to decide here and now this isn't what we want to be. We're not who we believe God calls us to be. There's a better tomorrow for us, and we're going to figure out what that looks like and how to get there. And we're going to relentlessly pursue it together.
Yeah. It seems to me that the chronic problem in so many churches is that they love to plan. They don't love to work. And it's because it's fun, AJ. It's fun to sit in a boardroom with a whiteboard and get some stuff up on there and say, here are the things we're going to do. We're going to do this. And then part of it is the nature of the meetings. So if you're only meeting once a month as a board, or there's a staff, even there's some church staffs that only meet once a month, there's just so much time for people to forget. And so that's part of the problem. But more chronically, I think the problem is that it's much more fun to plan than it is to work. But if you are always planning and never working, you'll never get anywhere.
Yeah.
And so making that shift from talkers to doers is critically important. And that's a word of advice to myself and to all of us. I mean, we're all guilty of talking about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we did X, Y, or Z, and not actually following through. A revitalized church is one that follows through on its commitments, that it makes commitments and then it executes on its commitments. And I think that sometimes we look at, faithful Great Commission churches, AJ, and go, wow, we could never be them. But the real difference between the churches that are bearing fruit and the churches that aren't are just the ones that are bearing fruit actually do something. And there's a lie in the church that exists that it's somehow unspiritual to do work. You know what I'm talking about? There's sort of a sense of like, well, I don't want to, this strategy stuff, it's just business and unholy. And I think that that's a lie from the pit of hell.
Mm-hmm.
Like making a plan and then working it is as biblical as it comes.
Yeah.
And God laid out plans for the tabernacle, right? God laid out plans for Noah to build an ark. If he spent all those years praying about the ark and not building it, he would have drowned in the flood with the rest. So if God is in the planning, then you ought to be faithful for the execution. And that's going to be the difference between fruitfulness and not being fruitful.
Absolutely. God is not going to have a problem with you deciding that you want to become Great Commission focused, that you want to prioritize disciple making in your church, that you want to be process oriented so that people are always making progress towards a deeper faith. He won't be angry with you if you ask him what he holds for you in the future, to give you vision for the future in how your church will affect the kingdom, how lives will be transformed because of you, and that you then actually get to work doing those things. Guarantee God won't be angry with you for spending the time to do any of that.
Well said. Yeah,
instead,
these are not things that anger God. I can't believe that you're busy working,
doing the things of me that I've laid out for you in my word. How dare you?
But AJ, you have heard it too. I mean, that's so many churches respond that way. Like, I don't know, this feels unholy. I don't know why. I don't know where that comes from.
Yeah,
but it's prevalent.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Now, if you want to sit down together in a smoke-filled room and go, how can we increase giving by 8.5% so that we can get that new church fan? Think about things. But if you want to work on the things that we've outlined today, I think you'll have Jesus cheering you on. So
for sure. I'm no cute segue today, but I because I couldn't think of one, but I do want to give a shout out and thanks to our sponsor for today's episode, Faith Street. They are a great partner for your church to give you a tool, a digital tool to help facilitate discipleship. We have talked about discipleship as a process and not needing to rely on programs. One of the things that you can do to not rely on programs so much to facilitate discipleship is you can use other kinds of tools. Because remember, programs are just a tool to facilitate discipleship. Something like Faith Street, AJ, it's also just a tool. It isn't discipleship. It's a tool to facilitate discipleship. So check out Faith Street, faithstreet.com/Malfers. Listeners to the podcast get 20% off their service. See if it's a good fit for you. If you've been trying to make Facebook work for your church to facilitate discipleship digitally, and you're finding it's not working particularly well, look at a tool that's built for the church. And that's what Faith Street is. So works on iOS and Android. So should cover the all your bases there.
Yep. That's FAITHSTREET.com/MAU.
What? What are you talking?
MAL.
How long have you been on the team, Abe? Do you know how to spell? I'll spell Malphurs for you. Malphurs.
Yes, what Scott said. Hey, thanks for listening. This was episode 93, and you can read the article on this topic today at malphursgroup.com/93. That's just 9 and 3. I can put those together.
Yeah, hey, just the number.
Thanks for being with us. We love you guys. We'll see you next week.
Bye.